41 years old, and to have written these books and gone on to become one of the most well-known names in all of fiction, but to have no concept that was going to be the case for her while she was alive. It's sad and interesting story.
It really does strike me as something you would read. It sounds like something you would read in a story, right? Like it's so tragic in a way that feels like it was engineered to be so prolific, and then to die so young and to have this lasting legacy beyond basically anyone else. If it just feels like a myth at this point.
Welcome, friends, to episode 193 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Jane Austen's 1815 novel, Pride and Prejudice. All right, forgive me, I must inquire whether reading this beloved classic elicited an intense felicity within you, James, or rather, sentiments more disagreeable and unbecoming of a man of your enviable station.
Indubitably, my good sir.
You didn't answer the question.
Yeah, I know, right?
The language of this novel was a bit overwhelming. It was quite a throwback to a very particular time and a very particular place.
I feel like I clicked a switch in my brain at some point. It started to feel less like something dated and maybe more something that was to be admired. I don't know. It definitely took me to a certain place. You know what I mean? Yeah. This novel, like, it added to the authenticity of like the status and the classness of the whole vibe of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting, important novel. I didn't know hardly anything about it. And I, doing research into Jane Austen was very cool, very interesting person. Putting it in historical context, I think, really helped me. And then there's the issue of reading a book that was written in 1815 today, and where literature has gone in modern times versus over 200 years ago, and how there's a lot of me that was struggling with just the different conventions and the difference in language and all the things that we do these days when it comes to plotting and pacing and everything else. Not to say that this book does none of it, because I actually was impressed with how well it holds up in some ways. Just in other ways, I did find myself struggling a little bit.
Yeah. With the way that we cover a lot of things on the podcast, and maybe specifically this time I didn't give myself quite as much time as I would have liked, but I felt like I was really trying to race through it at certain points. And I think I felt like I knew, making that decision to read through it quickly, I was sort of like passing by some of like the more poetic parts of the story, and like each sentence feels like something that could be, it's poetic in a sense, and then it's also like metaphorical, or like there's a lot more to it than just the substance of what's being said, the plot.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth. I have several pull quotes that I was struck by that I pulled out that I want to read. There is a lot of depth in this story, and I think it is held up as an important piece of work in honestly the English language and all of literature, and some of other Jane Austen's other novels as well, but I think this is her most well-known one. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag for me. I like to read every kind of thing, at least in some way, and for me, certain kinds of romance stuff I'll end up reading it more as almost an academic exercise. I like a romance plot, but I tend to like it more within a different kind of story. Like there might be a romance plot within a fantasy story or within sci-fi or something else. When that is the primary driver, which I guess is for this novel, although you could also argue it is more of a period piece about, although it wasn't a period piece for Jane Austen when she was writing it, because this was what she lived in. But looking at it now, it's like learning about a time and a place and the particular customs and weird sort of eccentricities of that class and that society. That is a big appeal to this novel, I think, and so that is something to look at there. But otherwise, I would say this is ultimately a well-written romance about two characters who eventually find a happily ever after, right? And those kind of stories I tend to read as more of an academic interest for me, because it's not the kind of genre that I pick up on my own. But it's not to say I can't find any way to enjoy it. And so I'm kind of mixed on this book, I guess.
Coming to this story last week, we ended our last episode announcing this project, and we were talking about how, like, I was excited to embrace the story and to like throw myself into a romance novel in a way I hadn't had a chance to necessarily in a long time, and like maybe see it with fresh eyes. And I walk away kind of having some of my preconceived notions confirmed, where I'm like, okay, like this isn't necessarily the kind of thing that I'm going to be continuing to reach for in the future. I don't have like a new love that I'm like gonna want to run out and read a ton more, but I did really enjoy it for what it was. And part of the thing that I liked about the story was that it felt, like you're saying, less like what I was expecting to be a pure romance, specifically about like how eternal their love is and how it's all perfect, and it was more of a story about like the political landscape of a certain time period, and like the way that women were treated in the society, and the way that the patriarchy was propped up, and like how our main character Elizabeth like navigates that and finds ways to have agency, and like a lot of that, even within a story where ultimately at the end there's like this happy ending where she ends up with a guy, and it's like in that way a romance novel. But
and it is I think you're speaking to a larger way than which the love story is situated. It's situated as a story about multiple families and their reputations, and the way that these marriages affects all these different people. There's like a web in that society, and it's operating in a sense against the pressures, especially like older pressures. It seems like old guard versus like wanting to be in love with somebody, and like whether or not that's something that's okay, and how you navigate that. And then also like the considerations outside of just your own happiness, but like what it's going to say about your family and your property and your status and all this other stuff.
Did you ever, by chance, catch any of Downton Abbey?
I have not seen any Downton Abbey.
No.
Like, honestly, this is a genre I don't know a ton about. Like, I know Bridgerton came out recently, and it was like a really fun modern take on this kind of romance, but with like no regards to historical accuracy, just like going for broke on raunchiness is my understanding. I haven't seen it, but and I know that's based off a book, but
I've heard people love that show, and I know it did super well on Netflix.
That book is sort of reacting to something like this, maybe not this particular novel, but like novels that were set in this time period. And I do think that having read this, I would appreciate something that's reacting to it more later. And then I was talking to a friend of the podcast, Remy Nakamura, and he was talking about some authors he knows who write like Regency magic stories, and like that's another thing to like know what genres people are touching on and what they're referencing. I think this is a good touchstone pillar of the genre to look at, so that I can be aware of the landscape, which I think is useful.
Yeah, and I even mentioned at the end of last episode how I felt like this was an embarrassing blind spot. Like, I think that this is like, for us to be culturally aware, we needed to have experienced the story in a way that we have. And so many things like that I would like. I've always been intrigued by the title Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and wondered like what that would be like. And like, I don't know if that story holds up at all with the added zombies. And I've always, but now I have the basis to go into it and really engage with it in a way that I couldn't have before. And like a lot of reading this reminded me of just like the family, like people vying for power, the way that ultimately like families want you to do a certain thing in these cultures. It reminded me a lot of like my experience with what I did see of Downton Abbey. Okay.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on there. I haven't seen it, so I don't know. One thing I did come away enjoying in this book, and I don't know, I guess I should have been expecting it, but I wasn't. Was there was an impressive amount of wit and sarcasm and banter, and that the dialogue was well written. Like the way the characters are interacted with each other. Elizabeth, in particular, I found really engaging. The Mr. Bennett, he seemed to have like a very similar him and Elizabeth had a very similar sense of humor and seemed to get along for that reason. And I liked a lot of his jabs he would take at his wife, who's a little bit ridiculous. So I throughout, I thought that the dialogue was always interesting, and kept me pretty well engaged.
Well, and I was surprised at just how much of it, because coming from a background in more fantasy and like medieval, this isn't medieval or anything by any stretch, but like this idea of an old English story, for some reason I'm accustomed to like a lot of like descriptions of landscapes and like it kind of felt like there was a little bit of that, but much more like dialogue driven. Not a lot of like descriptions of characters or places they are. We just get names of places and then, you know, the actual actions that take place along the way. And there is a narrator that like lends like a nice sort of extra layer to the story.
Yeah. It's a third person narration, but it does include a bunch of these like epistolary sections with different letters being written from different characters, which I think is pretty neat. And in my research, I found that is something that Jane Austen did quite a bit. And in fact, her previous novel was originally written as a series of letters that then she revised and to make into Sense and Sensibility was that novel. She later revised it to be. What's it, you do know or don't know?
No. I've heard a lot. I've just heard the name. So that's another blind spot that like I'm excited because I don't know a ton about Jane Austen, but I've heard the name plenty. So I'll be interested to hear what you found.
Yeah, very interesting. I have a lot of cool stuff to get into with her bio. But yeah, where I was going with that is I was impressed with the sort of structure and POV of this book. I liked all of that. I do want to give a shout out to the audiobook. That was how I experienced this novel. And it is narrated by Rosamund Pike, who we've talked about on Gone Girl and is going to be in the new upcoming Wheel of Time adaptation. And I believe she is in either the movie we're going to cover or a different version of this movie. Of this book. I'm not really sure. She's in one of them. I don't know who she plays or anything, but we can keep an eye out and say maybe she's in the one we're going to cover, the 2005 one. We'll keep an eye out. But it was very cool. She did a great job. And honestly, I think really helped bring alive some of the dialogue in a way that like a, bona fide movie star can do, and really like bring the emotion and bring the nuance to these lines and really sell them. And it's almost like scenes. So I really like that. And it was included with my Audible subscription. I didn't have to buy it with like a credit. So if you have Audible, honestly, like, check it out if you're interested. Yeah. It's pretty cool.
And as much as I said that I feel like I had to blow through it, it was a fairly short read. So I don't think it's that intimidating of a read if you're looking to like check out some literary stuff, which is kind of how I feel all the time. If not for the podcast, I feel like I would be trying to flesh out some of my knowledge on more literary stuff because I don't have a huge background in it.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's important, I think, to place this novel where it is. Because I was reading some reviews of it, people reading it today, and it's like, how do you rate a book? Like, how do you decide how you feel about a book? Because it's almost unfair to try and compare this novel to anything you've read that's been written in the last 50 years, right? Like, it's the novel as an art form was young when she was writing this. It had only really started becoming a thing in the English speaking world since the 1600s, and slowly over time was starting to build up. And she was reacting in the early 1700s. I was reading as like kind of the rise of the novel as an art form, and she's writing this in like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So I mean, it was pretty new, and I think it's an art form that doesn't have a limitation of technology, so it's kind of apples and oranges to compare it to like movies. But there is a little bit of something you could say for like, what would it be like to compare the latest Christopher Nolan flick or whatever to, a movie that was made in 1910, or whatever. Like it's kind of not fair to compare the two. in
mean,
some
like
ways.
there's things that are timeless, like composition. When you look at film, is timeless. Like you're always going to be able to look at a frame and know whether it was composed well. Things like that. Of course, you're gonna have limitations, but it does remind me of reacting to older films in the way that I do feel like I'm able to put myself in the shoes of something that's like, if it is influential in those ways, I feel like I can view it at that time, and then also like retroactively, show it reinforcing all of these other things along the way that I've seen.
Well, hugely influential this novel is, right? Like so many people who came after, and I was just, we'll get into the history behind it. It was written about a thing she experienced firsthand. Like this was basically her life was, she lived in these kind of circles, not necessarily the plot of what happened, but like, this is the kind of life she lived, the kind of people she was around. And she's writing about it. And the reason I think you're talking about how they would just name things is, it to me is written in a way that was like assuming you knew what she's talking about. Like assuming you know where these places are and what they look like. Like it was kind of written for this society, like for people who live in this world to read in some sense. Or maybe like, maybe you don't necessarily live in that world, but like you are aware of it. You're like close to it, right? I don't think she had any, I mean, I know she didn't have any expectation that this was going to be like a worldwide phenomenon that people would be talking about on a podcast 200 years later,
Yeah.
Like it's probably, it would be intensely mind blowing to know that for multiple reasons, obviously.
Of course, I knew that it was an older novel. I didn't know exactly the date. I didn't look it up when I was reading it, but to know that she was going through similar situations, it does feel like it's a risk, right? Because she's kind of pushing back against things that were the norm for the time. It feels like, what was the reaction of it early on? I'd love to know, like, did people push back against it right away, or did they embrace it fully? Like, was it sort of a rallying cry for women at the time?
Let me just back up a second and say that I like that you are picking up on that sort of subtle criticism and sort of satire being leveled at these characters. Like, it is... I picked up on the same thing. It felt like some of these characters were being shown to be kind of buffoons, or maybe they're of certain birth and certain standing, but they're actually not people that you like, or not people that you should respect. And I think that was a bit of a controversial thing to do. And there's a real attention to like realism and like in these circles, and there was that comedic kind of satirical undertones are there, but it is all also very subtle. And I was reading that one of the things that has made Austen so interesting for people to study, and there are people in academics who like devote their all of their research into talking about Jane Austen, and which, by the way, is kind of scary because I know there are going to be many people who listen to this who know a lot more about Jane Austen than I do.
Yeah.
And I'll probably screw some shit up. But I'm doing my best over here. But what I'm trying to say is, like, you can read Austen and this novel in many different ways, and like people have read it as sort of bolstering like Toryism and the aristocracy, and sort of a confirming of conservative England and like this society, and like people, you can read it that way. But then lots of other people have read it as early feminist a story about a woman who's sort of trapped and struggling to find her own way and her own ability to speak for herself and like value things like love and things like that. So like, and it's all subtle enough, and it's all sort of implied in ways that people have found ways to back it up with different readings of the text. And can say like, oh, you're reading this wrong, it's actually this, or you're reading it wrong, it's actually this. And that makes for like really interesting literature and a really interesting discourse over the years. And of course that has changed over time, and we'll get into some of that where I'll answer some more of your questions. But I think you're definitely asking the right questions.
my reading was definitely more the latter.
Yeah, mine too. But that's our own bias, though. You know what I mean? Like that's people bring their own biases.
More liberal thinking. We're thinking. So two things. I felt like having the main character be someone who very clearly was going against the status quo in many ways was that flag for me. Like that's what it was flagging for me, was just that like we can sympathize with this character. And the biggest thing, my second point that I was going to make, is the relatability of this story carrying on through the generations and still being relevant today, as why I think this novel is so notable and why people still talk about it. It's because like the class status things that are going on, maybe not to quite the degree, but everyone can relate to being in a situation where they felt like someone was looking down on them because of their class, or and obviously the title comes up at that point, the Pride and the Prejudice, and how people will judge a book by its cover early on, and those are some things that were just firing for me.
Yeah, and I like that, and I agree, because even though this ostensibly is a story about a very particular time and status that most people don't have, right. A lot of people have experienced having to consider their family when it comes to someone that they are going to end up marrying, and consider, just outside influences and reputations, and how that can kind of modify things. I think in America we really value the idea of like love as something that transcends everything else, and like nothing else, how much money you have, how much your family likes somebody, any of that stuff. Like we like to sort of believe that shouldn't matter, but that isn't necessarily the case everywhere else in the world. And in fact, for the majority of history, that wasn't the case. And even many places in America, that's not the case. So I did find like my own personal romantic sensibility sometimes didn't line up with like having to care about all this other shit. But it is interesting to read about people who do care about it. Right.
Well, have you ever been in a situation where like you like someone and someone else likes someone, and then the other person was maybe had more money than you, or was, did X, Y, or Z in their life that gave them a higher status, whether it was a high school thing or whatever, and they were using that actively against you and showing that you were inferior in that way? Like that's the kind of stuff that I felt like I was picking up on.
Yeah, I agree. One of the other things, because I was trying to figure out like, why has this novel endured for so long, and it is something that people still to this day love. And I should also say, not just the novel, like the adaptations, many of them are beloved, and we're going to watch one of the most beloved ones, is my understanding, so we'll get a taste of that. But I think there's a little bit of kind of like a Cinderella type element to this story.
Definitely.
Not in the sense of rags to riches, but that archetype that you see in so much romance of someone, winding up with not only a true love, but someone who is wealthy and a landowner and has a library in their house and servants, and is going to give you this sort of storybook life where you're going to live in the English countryside in a manor,
which doesn't really line up with like the character that we get throughout the rest of the novel. But I feel like I have some points that I can point to that still show that it's like the character's consistent, if that makes sense.
Which character? You're talking about Elizabeth? Or
like, okay. Elizabeth, like, in the way that like, it's, I don't think I can spoil an almost 200-year-old
don't worry about it.
At this point, but like she rejects him initially.
Yeah.
And then eventually like they come to find out that they like each other, and then eventually they end up together, and she sort of like, even though she's pushed back against all of these things that are the social norms of the time, she still ends up in that cookie cutter sort of within the patriarchy, under like with a guy who has all this money and wealth and status, and like everything's great, but like this character seemed like she was pushing back against all these gender norms and all of that other stuff, but then ultimately ends up in the place where we kind of,
which maybe that's why some people read it that way.
Right.
I do think that there's a bit of just that, like she is choosing it, and I think so she's happy. She's with someone she's genuinely in love with, and it happens to be a marriage that also winds up pleasing her family, improving their status in some ways, solving some of the problems they've been having. Sure, there are a few people it rubs the wrong way, but like she is happily ever after within her society. She's not like burning it down or anything, like
exactly,
but like, I don't know, I think there is sort of a wish fulfillment thing there of like, maybe societal issues aside, like it's a fun thing to think about. Like we should all love to spend a week as a aristocrat in 1800s England, which I'm sure isn't as fun as it sounds, without modern medicine and everything. But like, you know what I mean? Like, it's very romantic, and these giant houses and the horses and the the beautiful countryside, and it's a really a period and a lifestyle that people, feel a lot of affection for. And I think part of the appeal of this novel is like living in their shoes of these characters for the time in which you're reading the book. It transports you to this era and to this lifestyle. And I think that that's something people look for. We got to stop for a moment, though, and talk about Jane Austen, the person, and then we'll get into the plot and so forth. So I read a ton about her. There's a lot known, a lot that's not known. She was born in 1775, died in 1817 at the age of 41. She is primarily known for 6 major novels, which interpret, critique, and comment upon the British landed gentry at the end of the 18th century. Austen's plots often explore the dependence of women on marriage and the pursuit of favorable social standing and economic security. So, she wrote Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion, which were both published posthumously in 1818. So 6 major novels. A memoir was written about her after she died that is very notable for sort of making her popular, because she's one of those authors who was not famous and well read during her life. She published these novels anonymously, did not have her name attached to them. They were not widely read. Mostly, I was seeing that like critics thought they were fine, but they were not considered anything particularly notable. She sold the rights for them for like £10 British, which like wow. in the 1800s, I'm sure was more than it is today, but not that much.
How does it eventually get linked back to her?
So she starts writing these novels. She reads all the time. She's very intelligent, and she starts writing these books, and she's amusing her family and friends by reading them as she's writing them. She was just like read chapters to them, and they'd sit around the parlor probably while she reads them, right? And they're like, "Oh yes, it's very good," and that was kind of her like demonstration that she was an intelligent woman. You know what I mean? But at this time, and in this particular society, and that, a woman of her status or whatever, like, it wasn't considered okay for her to be a novelist. And in fact, if you were to try and be a novelist, it was considered like vain, or like you're like chasing fame, and you're this lioness who's like trying to, make a name for herself, as opposed to like being a good wife, right? So it wasn't an okay thing for her to really do. Her father liked her novels, and it's unclear whether or not she knew that he did this, but he was what tried to get them published early on, and I think one of them was rejected. It's unclear, at least in what I was seeing, how involved she was with the early attempts to get it published, but I know later on she was more involved. But again, she had to publish it anonymously because she couldn't have her name attached to it, because it would be considered something that would lower her in the eyes of the people she knew and in the circles she was running in. And that's a shame, but it's fascinating for me to think about her writing these novels that have gone on to become landmark pieces of work, right? Her novels actually got translated into French and started getting published and cheaply produced with like pirated editions. And so she didn't even know that her novels were actually making their ways into different places and being read. She wasn't getting a dime for any of that. And this is around that. We talked about this with Sleepy Hollow. Copyright law was not really a thing. And this was something that ended up having to be invented to combat some of these things that were going on for authors, where their work would just get pirated and republished somewhere else, and they wouldn't see a dime. And that happened with a lot of Austen's work. But eventually, after she died, her sister, I believe, Cassandra, Henry Austen, and Murray arranged for the publication of Persuasion and Northanger Abbey as a set. Those were the books that were published posthumously. Henry Austen contributed a biographical note, for which the first time identified his sister as the author of the novels. So she, for the first time, was identified as the author of these novels after she was already dead.
Wow.
Her novels were out of print in the 1820s. although they were still being read as copies that were housed in private libraries and circulation, sort of hand-to-hand stuff. In 1832, Richard Bentley purchased the remaining copyrights to all her novels, and over the following winter published 5 illustrated volumes as part of his standard novels series. In 1833, Bentley released the first collected edition of her works, and since then, Austen's novels have been continuously in print, so 1833. So I was reading that the publication of James Edward Austen Lee's, I'm not sure what the relation is. I think his is like it's a nephew. Yes, because it's about his aunt. Yeah. So he writes this book called A Memoir of Jane Austen in 1869. And this kind of introduces her to the wider public, where he talks about his aunt's life and her sort of anonymously writing these books and the story of her doing this. And the memoir goes on to sell well, and then all of a sudden people all across the country and around the world start becoming interested in this author. And she became so popular in the 1880s and around the start of the 20th century, there's a clique of people who started to call themselves the Janeites because they were so into her writing, and they get so into it that they become hipsters about it. And they get upset when she starts becoming hugely popular. And they're like, all these new people don't know that we've been here since the beginning liking Jane Austen. And so they like rebel against this like wide popularization of her. It's
Wow.
like, so if you think about like what we see all the time in pop culture today, like that happened early on with Austen at like the end of the 1800s.
I can't believe it's so fascinating to me that, and of course, like there's plenty of artists through time that create the art just for themselves, but with seemingly no avenue for publication, to just be continuing to write because it's your passion in that way, and sometimes show it to your family, and then for it to be so well written and so meticulous and so influential for such a long time, and to have it just be, I don't know, to never see any of that impact, and I don't know, it's haunting that it bothers me, that Jane Austen never got to see any of her success. And there's so many artists like that, but to be so influential and to be still talked about in literary circles, and to be seen as one of these, like, one of the great authors of the last 200 years or whatever, maybe one of the greatest novelists ever.
No, I mean, it's tragic, and you're right on. She is one of the greatest novelists of all time, I think. I think that's safe to say. She's been listed among them. People, different, places have tried to come up with them, and she's been compared to, people like Shakespeare. And of course, she also has detractors, like Henry James decried what he called a beguiled infatuation with Austen, in what he saw as a rising tide of public interest that exceeded Austen's, quote, intrinsic merit and interest. So there's people who were anti-Janites, is what I'm seeing here, which included people like Mark Twain, Charlotte Bronte, D.H. Lawrence, Kingsley Amis.
These people were all anti?
They were anti. So this, because she was so in vogue for people to love. So then you had all these famous authors coming out against her. And it's so fascinating that all this is taking place long after she's dead, right? So it's really weird. I don't know, to think about that. But and people have looked back at these and said that it tended to be more of artistic disagreements, and like, this is what I want to do artistically. This is what I think a novel should be. This is the kind of book I want to write. And a lot of these authors were trying to differentiate themselves from the kind of writing that Jane Austen was doing, and say that I'm going to do something different. And it seems to be more about that than anything else, right? Like,
well, we tend to see that even today, just people being a reaction to other things, like George R.R. Martin being a reaction to someone like Tolkien. Not that he hates his writing or wants to tear him down, but it's more of like he wants to be so different that he doesn't want to be compared in some ways. And I think that's probably what we're seeing with other authors, like having to try to sell up against someone like a Jane Austen, and like to say like, we can't compete in some ways, and to say like, look, mine is more interesting.
And you are touching on it, like they were alive and trying to sell, whereas Austen was dead and probably selling really well, and they were probably like hey, stop buying her stuff and buy ours. Yeah, I mean, maybe that might have been part of it. So the book itself, Pride and Prejudice, is sort of a satire or critique of what were known as sentimental novels or novels of sensibility, that were a little bit predating this novel. They were in the 1700s when she was writing this. And this was a literary genre I didn't know much about. I read about it here. It was a genre that celebrates the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment, sentimentalism, and sensibility. And it was in fashion in both poetry and prose at the beginning of the 18th century, in a reaction to the rationalism of the Augustan age. So we're getting into like real historical stuff here about the history of novels and the history of fiction. But I think it's interesting that like this was a reaction to something that came before it too, like we see so often, right? And it was a reaction from within that society, though. You know what I mean? She wasn't critiquing it from the outside. She was critiquing it from within. And I think you can read a lot into, you know, these women who are struggling in this world and see a lot of what I assume Jane Austen was going through. One thing I did read was that she had a love. A lot of people... Okay, so first off, not a lot is known about Jane Austen because she died before she was famous, right? So everything people know about her was through her surviving family members who would later like share details, and they read a bunch of her letters. She wrote like thousands and thousands of letters. Mm-hmm. But her sister also admitted to having burned thousands of letters of hers.
Why?
And the what people believe, and I don't know if this was confirmed or not, but she apparently would write sort of scathing descriptions of people they knew and like talk bad about them and stuff. And her sister didn't want the people that they knew to find out about it. So she burned them all to like, rather than face the embarrassment of like, oh, she one time she talked bad about so-and-so and now people know that, which is sad because now all of that is lost to time, right? Like we'll never know. But it does go to show that she had that like insightful, biting personality and clearly was very clever and very funny, and you know was writing about people all the time apparently that she knew.
That's funny. So such a like caught in the present thing to do, to burn something like that after someone's death.
Well, she has no idea like, that what Jane Austen's going to go on to be. Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But I did read that she apparently had someone that people think now, looking back at her letters, there was a man that she fell in love with who was not, it looks like he was trying to become a barrister, which is like a lawyer. And he didn't have enough money and enough like status to be a worthy pairing for her and within her sort of circles. So she ended up not being able to pursue a relationship with him. But there was evidence of her like continuing to think about him and letters written years and years later. So it seems like maybe she did have one sort of great love that ended up not being able to be. She didn't get to have her fairy tale romance. You know what I mean? Because this guy was not of the status that he needed to be for it to be okay. And so I think that tension being in a lot of her books, the tension between, you know, making your family happy and fitting the roles that society has for you, but then also wanting to have love. Obviously, this is something she had to deal with in her own life. And her own family also was going through issues with like their fortunes and their property. And so a lot of that would make it into the books. So, yeah. Again, I don't know all the specifics. I read a ton of information and I'm sure people know way more about this. So I'm sorry if I'm getting things wrong. Do feel free, educate us. If I see some really interesting stuff, I'll talk about it next time on the pod if I get a moment to next time. But at the very least, I'd be curious to know. So if I got any of this wrong, please feel free to let me know.
So do we know, I mean, obviously it was such a long time ago, but like dying in your 40s, like was it just part of the time? Was it something, do you know why she died so young?
She started getting ill in the 1816. A lot of it now is people looking back and trying to sort of diagnose it retrospectively, but I think it was kind of an unknown illness. But retrospectively, biographers, it looks like in the mid 1960s or whatever, are still trying to figure out what it was. And the current thinking is that she had Addison's disease, although her final illness has also been described as resulting from Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Wow.
So I don't know how those two things play in together. I'm not a doctor, but that's what I'm seeing here. Just kind of a mysterious illness. People not really sure why or what, but she would often sort of talk about this in sort of light-hearted ways. And letters she would write, she was saying that she was turning every wrong color. She was spending her life chiefly on the sofa. She would often refer to her condition as bile and rheumatism. Apparently, it's kind of cracking jokes about it, but she, as the illness progressed, she started to experience difficulty walking, lacking energy, became confined to her bed, and unfortunately suffered a lot of pain. And by the end, they said that she was welcoming death because of how much pain she was in. So,
jeez,
very unfortunate.
That's rough.
And again, 41 years old, and to have written these books and gone on to become one of the most well-known names in all of fiction, but to have no concept that was going to be the case for her while she was alive. It's a sad and interesting story.
It really does strike me as something you would read. It sounds like something you would read in a story, right? Like it's so tragic in a way that feels like it was engineered to be so prolific, and then to die so young and to have this lasting legacy beyond basically anyone else. If it just feels like a myth at this point.
Yeah, well, we got to move into plot here. So I've got 3 paragraphs of plot. I'll read each one and we can react to them real quick and talk about this book.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, so Pride and Prejudice is set in rural England in the early 19th century, and it follows the Bennet family, which includes 5 very different sisters. Mrs. Bennet is anxious to see all her daughters married, especially as the modest family estate is to be inherited by William Collins when Mr. Bennet dies. At a ball, the wealthy and newly arrived Charles Bingley takes an immediate interest in the eldest Bennet daughter, the beautiful and shy Jane. The encounter between his friend Darcy and Elizabeth is less cordial. Although Austen shows them intrigued by each other, she reverses the convention of first impressions. Pride of rank and fortune and prejudice against the social inferiority of Elizabeth's family hold Darcy aloof, while Elizabeth is equally fired both by pride of self-respect and by prejudice against Darcy's snobbery. Okay, so this summary is clearly defining Pride and Prejudice for us in this book.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I did read that there's some discussion about whether or not it may have just been chosen as a marketing title because her previous book was called Sense and Sensibility. And so they're like, well, her next book, let's call it Pride and Prejudice, and we can kind of keep this little naming convention going. Anyway, but people have taken it to be like a big thematic thing to talk about. And I do think it's valid to look at that. I also saw it was originally called First Impressions was the name of this novel.
That makes sense.
Which makes some sense too. So
I love, speaking of first impressions, I love the juxtaposition of Elizabeth and Darcy and Jane and Bingley, and the way that Bingley and Jane right away have this relationship where they hit it off. It's smooth sailing. There's it's pretty clear that they're love at first sight, and they're the traditional sense of everything that you would see in a romantic story like this. And Elizabeth and Darcy right away basically hate each other.
Yep.
He's talking, he calls her plain looking or something, and he's talking shit about her status, and
she's not handsome enough to attract his interest or something.
Yeah.
She overhears him say that.
And so all of these things are showing that clearly these people are not meant for each other, but the juxtaposition of the usual romantic first encounter and the way that everything's pretty good from there on.
And also
is nice.
it creates sort of an enviable situation for her where she's looking at her sister and going why can't I have that? But yeah, I mean, we do see here early indications that Elizabeth is not going to allow herself to be taken in by somebody who's a jerk. And Darcy's a jerk early on. He's aloof. He's better than this whole situation. There's nobody here who's of the standing that he wants, I guess. And at least that's how he comes off, right? And he doesn't want to dance with anybody. He's just kind of a jerk to everybody. And Elizabeth doesn't like him. And that's the first impressions, right? First impressions are not good here.
Right, exactly.
I have one here, one quote here I'll read. First off, I guess I should say this book has a very famous beginning, which I know is something we talk about a lot on the pod. So I'll go ahead and say, here's the beginning of this novel.
Wait, are you going to call it one of Luke's
banging beginnings? I mean, this is a very notable beginning. I do think it's a good one. I don't know if it qualifies as one of my favorites, but it's cool. So let's talk about it. The quote is, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." So that is a famous line. When the book opened that way, I was like, oh, I've heard this line before. And it does set up this book, right? Like it is tonally sort of lighthearted, but also trying to say something universal. It is written in sort of a certain fashion that the whole book is written in, right? So it's a good opening line in the sense that it sets you up for what kind of book you're going to read.
It says it's kind of a universal thing, but at the end of the day, that's this society at this present moment more than anything. That's giving you that framework.
That's the perception, at least in this society. Yeah, that's a good point. So I did have a line here about the difference between vanity and pride, which I thought was pretty cool. So, quote, "Vanity and pride are different things. Though the words are often used synonymously, a person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us." So there's a distinction here between that sort of like inner pride, like that feeling confidence in oneself, and that is something to be admired, I think. And where it transitions into vanity is where it becomes a preoccupation in what others will think of us. And that's an interesting distinction to make, and a clever bit of writing. So this is what we were talking about, where like there is some really excellent bits of writing in here, and honestly throughout, that do lend themselves to talking about and sort of dissecting.
I know that you said that the Pride and Prejudice may not have been the first title, but I did find myself thinking about the Pride and the Prejudice, and not just obviously I think we're supposed to believe that the Pride would be Darcy and the Prejudice would potentially be Elizabeth, but there's Pride and Prejudice in almost every character that we come up into in the society, in the way that there's like they have preconceived notions about almost everyone that they come in contact with, and everyone is holding everything very close to the chest, and they want people to think of them. So maybe it should be called Vanity and Prejudice, but like the way that they want people to see them because of the whole status of it all. The way that if you have more status, you have more power within this world.
The courting game is sort of also one of the major, plot lines of this book. Like all these different daughters trying to court these different men. And not just for themselves, but on their family's behalf, right? And then the mother getting involved, and then like different mothers and different families like competing with one another and like talking trash about each other to these guys to try and be like, oh, you shouldn't talk to them, you should talk to my daughter who's better for whatever reason. And I think getting sort of, if you can get caught up in that game and the turnings of it, and the backstabbing and the sort of wittiness and like all of that, I think you're going to have the most fun with this book. As a reader. My problem was I just wasn't really that interested in it.
It was
and so like I could recognize that like that was the disconnect. So I was like, I should really probably care more about this stuff, but I was struggling to care. And so sometimes when it was like a lot of this kind of like vying, it became kind of dry for me, and I don't know. I struggled to care.
I agree. I mean, I was able to work through it, but I think in ways appreciate it, especially when I had finished a chapter when there was a lot of that, and I think that's just showing that like it's not necessarily my preferred. But by the same note, I do want to say like it does feel a lot like I don't know. There's a lot of like political shows where it's about like vying for power, And it does it like if you even like that, I think you could click into a story like this in ways. But you do have to. I think the biggest thing is you do have to be really invested in the characters and some of the time you could tell that the characters were kind of just side characters in this story about Elizabeth and Darcy. And it felt like it wasn't quite as interesting to hear if so-and-so ends up with so-and-so and why they were able to blackmail so-and-so into doing that.
I suspect a lot of that is going to get streamlined in the adaptations because there was a lot of time spent on the different daughters and their relationships,
right?
Which I'm sure, we won't even be able to get into all the little details. Speaking of, let's read the next paragraph of plot. So, the pompous Collins subsequently arrives, hoping to marry one of the Bennet sisters. Elizabeth, however, refuses his offer of marriage, and he instead becomes engaged to her friend Charlotte Lucas. During this time, Elizabeth encounters the charming George Wickham, a military officer. There is a mutual attraction between the two, and he informs her that Darcy has denied him his inheritance. After Bingley abruptly departs for London, Elizabeth's dislike of Darcy increases as she becomes convinced that he is discouraging Bingley's relationship with Jane. Darcy, however, has grown increasingly fond of Elizabeth, admiring her intelligence and vitality. While visiting the now-married Charlotte, Elizabeth sees Darcy, who professes his love for her, and proposes. A surprised Elizabeth refuses his offer, and when Darcy demands an explanation, she accuses him of breaking up Jane and Bingley. Okay, let's stop there. So, the pompous Collins shows up. This guy is that example we were talking about. Like he is someone who's got a lot of money. It would make a lot of sense for Elizabeth to marry him. I think he's the guy who's going to inherit their home, so it would like keep access to it, I guess. There's a lot of things as far as like status and money goes for marrying him, but he's kind of a dick, and he doesn't really care. Like, he clearly doesn't care about her, as evidenced by him proposing to Charlotte, like, the next day. Like, it doesn't matter. He's just looking to get married to somebody, kind of thing. And Elizabeth stands up for herself, and she ends up refusing this proposal. And I like that Mr. Bennet, like, has her back, even though her mom says she's made a huge mistake,
Yeah, it, again, doesn't really feel like it's the norm for that time period. Right. I think that typically the father would, I think everybody in this situation, if I had to guess, would have been like, yeah, this is a good move. And also we have 4 other daughters, so hopefully we can sort of spread our bets out and then hit on something that secures the financial like freedom of the family going forward and make sure that everything seems like it's going to continue as it has been, because it seems like the father's done pretty well, which brings up the fact of like, why would he have like signed this specific, I don't know.
I couldn't tell you
bylaw
the
that basically sends
of why
his property,
something to do with like a male heir. I think it's because he doesn't have a son. Maybe that must just be a law in this
contractually something, or I don't know. Yeah, maybe it was a law, but seems pretty dumb.
Yeah. So Darcy has this like moment where at some point he decides, actually, you know what? I do like Elizabeth. She's smart. She's interesting. She's beautiful. I don't know what I was smoking when I said that she, wasn't very handsome or whatever. Like, he realizes the folly of his ways. But of course now she kind of hates him. And she is also starts talking to this guy who's telling her about how terrible he is. About how he's denied the inheritance. I think Wickham, is that the character's name? Wickham, this military officer, and who has this former, relationship with the Darcy and the Darcys, and like, he's telling her lies. We find out later about why the inheritance didn't get sent. I don't know all the details, but I know that it's lies because we find out later that it had to do with, he like tried to court Darcy's sister, who was like 15 at the time, and then I guess that is why he ended up being pissed at him, because he was like trying to get the money through like underhanded ways.
Well, I think he was also a gambler too, and like had like owed a bunch of money and was in debt, and that comes to play a part at some point. And he's lied about all of this to Elizabeth, who buys it kind of hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, and her first impression is wrong, right? Like, she likes this guy. She finds him really charming. There's a mutual attraction there. She believes all this stuff.
Yeah, and she's like, oh, that makes sense because, like, he seems like a dick. Like, Darcy seems like a dick, so of course he would do all of these things you're saying he would do.
And that's where, like, the story turns, right? Is this idea of, like, these first impressions being wrong and being willing to, like, dig past that and find the truth of the matter. And so, but while she's still in this like bias against Darcy, understandably, he proposes to her because apparently that's what you do when you decide you like someone. You just walk up to him and go, "Hey, you want to get married?" Yeah. Professes his love to her, but then he also is kind of a dick about it because he also talks a lot about like how her station and her status is so bad and her family is like in such dire straits that she should be happy to marry him. Yeah. And I think that just rankles Elizabeth even more because that probably reminds her of like the other guy, Collins. Like it just, you know, she's like, no, I don't want this. And she says no to him. And, you know, off he goes. And we're thinking like, you know, what's next here? I guess our characters have bounced off of each other. Are you ready for the third paragraph?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So the third and final. Darcy subsequently writes Elizabeth a letter in which he explains that he separated the couple largely because he did not believe Jane returned Bingley's affection. He also discloses that Wickham, after squandering his inheritance, tried to marry Darcy's then 15-year-old sister in an attempt to gain possession of her fortune. With these revelations, Elizabeth begins to see Darcy in a new light. Shortly thereafter, the youngest Bennet sister, Lydia, elopes with Wickham. The news is met with great alarm by Elizabeth, since the scandalous affair, which is unlikely to end in marriage, could ruin the reputation of the other Bennet sisters. When she tells Darcy, he persuades Wickham to marry Lydia, offering him money. Despite Darcy's attempt to keep his intervention a secret, Elizabeth learns of his actions. At the encouragement of Darcy, Bingley subsequently returns, and he and Jane become engaged. Finally, Darcy proposes again to Elizabeth, who this time accepts. And that's where we're in the summary, but like there's a lot that goes into all this, right? As always. But yeah, what did you think of the sort of the ending of the novel here as things come together?
We've talked about it a bit, but I mean, like it starts to turn into a story where we can see the ending coming, where it seems like it's going to be sort of the happier ending. When she goes to like visit his residence, basically, I was like 100% sure that things were going to go well from here on. Yeah. And she's like falling in love with
impressive library.
Exactly. And it's clearly like almost a metaphor for himself. Like more than meets the eyes. He's got like intellect. He's got all these things that,
all
that
the servants love him and talk about how great he is and all this stuff. Yeah. It's like, oh, he's not the guy I expected him to be. Yeah.
So it's like a indirect way of showing all of the intricacies and the insides of this character that we've kind of come to like more and more as time has gone on, and so is Elizabeth. And then
it is clever to have him. He proposes, then he gets rejected, and so now he's in a case where he thinks like, oh, she doesn't like me at all. Like I still like her, she doesn't like me at all, and so now he's feeling like hurt. But then she realizes that she's been sold all these lies from the letter, right? And so now she's starting to view him differently. And then she realizes that she's sort of wounded him in a way. And she's starting to see him in a new light and going, maybe I was wrong about him. And so you have this like tension of what's come before. And how do you move past that now? It is interesting how like money solves everything, right? Like the situation with Wickham and Lydia. Darcy just sort of pays him off, and I guess that's okay now. It doesn't seem like the kind of guy you'd want to have with your sister, but okay.
I haven't read or seen. I know this, and I probably shouldn't even make a reference to it because I don't know enough about it, but it reminds me of something that you would hear in like a 50 Shades of Grey story, where it's like, and then he just paid for everything and took care of everything, and it was all happily ever after.
Well, he's 10,000 a year or whatever, right? Like they keep talking about how much money he makes.
Yeah, which I was trying to gauge it in like 1800s.
Yeah, clearly a lot more than it is today.
Yeah. So this idea that he just like pays it all off, and that's like romantic in a way because he's done it for Elizabeth to like, sure up the future of the family, and she can make
power, right?
right, and she can make an unbiased decision. It doesn't have to be about her family's financial future anymore. It can be about whether she actually likes him or not, and whether she wants to be with him in that way.
Yeah, and just it's kind of that wish fulfillment stuff. Like, I'm sure even now everybody wishes that they had enough money to just wave at problems and they go away.
Yeah.
So there's this scene that I actually really like where this Lady Catherine shows up, and kind of unannounced too, it seems like, and she's dropping in and she has this confrontation with Elizabeth where she's like, you are not going to get with Mr. Darcy. He is betrothed to his cousin, and they have been betrothed since birth, and you're not going to step in here. And like they're not like engaged or anything at this point anyway. In fact, I don't even think he knows that she likes him, and vice versa. Like she doesn't know if he still likes her, but Elizabeth refuses to back down, and she's like, I'm not going to promise that, like, get out of here. And like, I thought this was a cool moment of her standing up to somebody who clearly has the like elevated status, more money, more reputable, all that stuff. In this kind of old guard, like, his marriage has been arranged since birth. Like, who are you to step in here? You have no name, you have no status. Nobody cares about who you are. You're no good for him. And I like that Elizabeth stands up for herself, and she ends up, like, Lady Catherine basically leaves in a huff and goes on to talk to Darcy, Mr. Darcy, and like to dissuade him from getting with Elizabeth, but it has the opposite effect. And this is the way that he learns that she actually does still like him. I thought that was all clever. I liked that scene a lot. I don't know. I thought that was cool.
Yeah. And I think that this was the final thing that I needed to see out of Elizabeth for me to buy all of what we saw leading forward, because like you said, and I really like the quote actually where she says something along the lines of she's not going to promise anything against her own happiness.
Yeah.
And that her own happiness is a good key to the ending here, where it's like she's not, like we talked about this whole patriarchal system that's clearly going on, and like she's choosing something that's for her own happiness, and like it does end up being her decision at the end of the day. Whether it fits into the mold of what's like socially normal or not. So in that way, I think it really is fitting with Elizabeth all the way through. And I think I can buy it as a story where it seems to me to be female empowerment and a character with agency choosing her own destiny.
Yeah, it is. I can see that reading of it. It is fascinating that it's not clear that that is necessarily what's going on here, but there's definitely that reading is there. I thought it was really notable that at the end of the book, where most romances that I've read, and my knowledge of them, is they tend to like kind of focus on that happily ever after and sort of the fairy tale nature of it. Whereas we get more of a description of what goes on with like everybody in the family once they're together. And they have to seek people's blessing. Like she has to go to her father, and there's kind of a fairly touching conversation where she has to convince her father that she actually does love him. And that, clearly is like the only thing Mr. Bennet, wanted to make sure of before he gave the blessing. He's like, you got to be sure, because I know you. And if you don't like him, you don't like this guy, it's not going to work out. Like, you're going to be miserable, and I don't want that for you. And she has to convince him, like, no, I actually do like him. He seems like a jerk. I know everybody thinks he's a jerk, but he's actually not. And she has to like kind of go around talking that way. But then like her mother is just immediately excited and like, she's more worried about like impressing Mr. Darcy than anything else. Which kind of is in line with the way her character's been all along. But then we hear about like what happens with each of her sisters and how the family dynamic is now. And then the book sort of ends. And I just thought it was interesting that the focus wasn't as much on these two characters who we followed all along and their sort of happiness at the end, as much as it is about their happiness as it is situated among all these other characters and the social sort of web we've been weaving here.
Yeah. No, yeah, I like that a lot. It's not like the end of Cinderella where it's just like a kiss and then a fade to black, or like a ride off into the sunset kind of thing. Like we have to like figure out how all the pieces fall into place.
It's interesting that you say the end of Cinderella, because we talked about how the family gets dealt with in different ways in the different versions of that story, right?
Yeah, that's
like
true,
sometimes they're like punished, or sometimes they're welcomed into the castle, and so different things happen. And again, like that's kind of interesting to look at here, because the family is sort of an essential part to, if she's gonna go forward being happy, not only is she happy in love, but she's happy in the sense that she has done right by her family. So she kind of gets the best of all worlds in that sense. Yeah. All right, man. I think we're about done here with the book. I am super interested to watch this movie now. I'm excited to see how a modern filmmaker is going to take this thing and pare it down into a 2-hour story, thereabouts. And I'm definitely into it. I hope I get to feel like I am in this era and
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun to see it represented on film. I've already been like sort of imagining what I think the cinematography can look like and the color. Like, I feel like it's going to be very warm, and there's going to be lots of gowns and elegant candlelit moments and things like that. Like, I'm excited. I think it could be really cool to see this represented.
Maybe we have to get some top hats or something for the next week.
Yeah.
We actually are hoping to have a guest on, so pay attention to that. So hopefully we can get another perspective in here, which I think will be good. This project was a Patreon voted quarterly project. We put a poll up for people to weigh in on. It was selected and voted to the top. We do these things every 3 months or so. So if you wanted to hop on our Patreon, you can become a part of choosing the next one. We have 1 more this year, and then we'll do 4 more next year. That's the plan. So if that interests you, check it out. We also have bonus content that comes out every month. So check out Patreon. And shout out to all the patrons who voted for this. Thanks for doing it. And I figure that they must have been having a little fun choosing this, because they're like, this is probably not the sort of thing that they would choose on their own. But that's what these are for, right? Like, you can have us do things we wouldn't necessarily choose on our own.
Right. And I appreciate it for that reason. Good chance, like I said, to cover something like this. It's a good excuse to get to cover like a Jane Austen. So also connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of those at Ink to Film. And if you want to join the Council of Inklings, we post polls and all kinds of other stuff that can help shape the show and decide what we cover outside of that Patreon quarterly project.
Yeah, and that's on Facebook. If you liked this episode, as we sort of struggle to talk about Jane Austen and in ways that I'm sure doesn't quite do it justice, but if you're feeling generous and you enjoyed this episode, we'd love to see it in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you use to listen. If you're on YouTube, like the video, make sure to subscribe, follow, on whatever platform you're on. These all help the metrics so that we can like lay it at the feet of the great algorithm and hope that we'll share our show to more people.
Yeah, I've heard that smashing that bell helps as well.
Yes, I have heard that as well.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. I'm curious to see if I keep reading this stuff and watching this stuff, am I going to start speaking like these people? Is it going to start seeping into my dialogue?
We can only hope.
Yeah,
that we could be so elegant.
Yeah, right. We do speak clumsily by comparison these days, it seems like to me. Anyway, we will be back next week. We hope you join us for it. And until next time,
keep adapting.